Every year, there are more and more indie games coming to Steam, and so many of them get overlooked on a regular basis. That's why I've always done the Overlooked Games of the Year list. So many games are looked at and discarded for insane reasons in the big picture. Too pixely, too out there, too, well, anything. Hell, that's even if they're seen at all. I try to put a spotlight on those games by streaming 2 to 3 new indies a week, and in that effort, every now and again, I shine my light on something so sparkling, I realize, yeah, this is why I do this. Fallen Leaf is a retro side-scrolling platformer that released on the PC on July 15th, 2024 for the price of $16.99. It takes the games from the 8-bit and 16-bit era with influences from games such as Mega Man 2, DuckTales, and Super Mario Bros. 2, and brings it into the modern day with some fun characters and about 15 hours worth of content at 100% completion, maybe even more. And let's get this out of the way for those who just want a recommendation on whether to play the game and no other information about how good the game is. Bam! A 97 out of 100. A must-buy in my scoring system even if you're hurting for cash, and that doesn't even take into account my enhancer system. But more on that at the end of the review. But why is Fallen Leaf, which may look to you like any other pixel platformer, such a high recommendation for me? Well, hopefully I can explain that over the next 30 to 40 minutes. Enough so that it doesn't become the obvious overlooked game of the year on the channel because it didn't get enough attention. At the game's start, you'll play as Leaf, a treasure hunter with a sister Petal, and you'll come across a cave that supposedly has some treasure. After knocking out a completely innocent bear, you'll end up releasing an ancient evil named Xankalos, along with the hero of legend, Willow, who's a little out there. He tells you that it's up to you to find the Stone of Power to deal with Xankalos and to seal him away, and then he just sort of screws off. Now, it's a typical platformer and hero plot, but even from the get-go, something feels a little bit different and odd about this. I mean, you did knock out a completely innocent bear, like I said, and Willow isn't exactly the most prototypical wise man in this story. But you probably didn't click on this video to start with the story. You probably want to know about the gameplay, so let's start there. The gameplay is your basic platformer with action elements that on the surface most resemble something like the opening stages of Mega Man 2. Leaf has a basic pellet shot that he can shoot forward while also having the ability to slide. Enemies have distinct patterns and will either attempt to run into you or fire their own projectiles to hit you. Now you can take a hit or two, as long as you have hearts in the upper left-hand corner. And this shouldn't be anything that new to anyone who's played an action platforming game in the last several years, or last 20 to be exact. But very quickly, you'll start to learn that Fallen Leaf isn't a one-trick pony in this category, and it's going to start mixing things up and mixing up your opportunities to succeed. First of all, Leaf isn't going to be your only character that you play with. Not even close. In fact, by the end of the game, depending on which things you do, you'll have 9 more characters, all having slight differences in their abilities. Now, not all of them are going to be required characters, only a few of them are going to be ones that come across the main path, like Petal, your sister, who can jump a little higher than you. Gee, why is that familiar? But she's a little slippery on the landing, and she also has a buddy named Pollen, who acts as a semi-homing attack character, as she can end up hitting characters if she gets close enough to them in terms of the vertical area, sort of like what you see on screen here. Then there's Thorn, who is more melee-focused, but can get bursts of speed after killing enough enemies. Some of the optional characters have more out-there abilities, such as Lubby the Crab, who can grab onto platforms, even multiple times in a row to save himself, but is a little tricky to get a handle of at first. Or DBR-15, an alien who has a jetpack and a laser gun. Wonderful. I won't go into every other character, but each of them have their own quirk that makes them stand out compared to others, but not so much so that there isn't a base set of gameplay that all of them rely on. So let me get to the main question that you probably have. From a platforming perspective and a gameplay standpoint, where would I put Fallen Leaf in terms of quality? Well, there has been a consistent comparison from those people who I've seen review the game that put it on the same level as Shovel Knight, which is obviously high praise. So do I agree? Yes and no, but not for the reason of no that you may think, because I think that puts Fallen Leaf into a box, and I don't think that's fair to either Shovel Knight or Fallen Leaf. Fallen Leaf is not Shovel Knight. Fallen Leaf is not Mega Man 2. Fallen Leaf is Fallen Leaf, and it's at the pinnacle of level design and action platforming, especially when it comes to flexible design. One of the things that I immediately noticed about Fallen Leaf was that anybody who grew up in the 8 and 16-bit eras of the NES and SNES will immediately be at home here in more ways than one. Which, okay, the DNA of games like this are inherent in the art style, of course, but here, it's much more than that. Because if you played games like DuckTales, Mega Man 2, Castlevania, you'll start to recognize specific enemy movement patterns. I mean, just take a look of these enemies side by side. Now, some may say that it's almost theft of sorts, but no, I disagree. It's anything but. It's what I would call an homage plus. Of course, the movement looks very similar here, and the attack patterns force the same type of reactions like they did in the original games. So okay, it's got some nostalgia elements in it, but why use these specific attack patterns in a hodgepodge of different enemies? Well, one of the reasons that you'd use a design like this is the test the learning of the player and what skills they have. Let me take an example here, starting with a basic enemy early on, the crab. The crab has a simple walk pattern, moving along its platform left to right. You could destroy him, of course, but you could also just walk by him by just jumping over him and moving on. Now, it's simple, and it can teach you that you can deal with enemies by running past them if you so desire, but that's not the lesson I want to focus on here, as it's not as strong as the one that I'm about to refer to. Now, I have the same enemy type here, but it's a little bit different. It's not just a crab, it's a bone crab. But what happens if I kill this enemy? It'll throw out bones when it dies. Bones that can hit you and make you take damage. Now, this of course isn't a new idea in the space, but what's the difference between these two crabs? Well, if I'm too close to the bone crab when I kill him, I will have to dodge the bones to not take damage. The first time I'll probably will take damage when I first encounter it, and it's probably towards the start of the stage, because, well, it's going to introduce it in the desert levels. So I'll learn that lesson quickly. So I learn that I want to be more at range when dealing with these enemies. It's teaching me that bones equals be cautious near this enemy if you're going to kill it. So if I see a bone enemy on a small platform when I can land on it and not have a lot of room to maneuver, I should probably find a way to alternately deal with it or try to kill it at range because, well, I don't want to take damage. Whether it be a spiral bullet pattern that teaches you positional movement in movement with others, or rhythmically moving along a moving conveyor belt that tests timing and precision jumping. The game is always keeping you learning and adapting to the situation. The enemy variety is strong and pointed, reminding you of games of old and new, while still feeling fresh thanks to the mixture of enemies. Yet, I'm still not touching on what is even more brilliant about the gameplay here. The thing is, with 10 different characters, all having little subtleties to their movement, you'd think that become too much, or that you'd have to be switching back and forth between characters a lot. I mean, you can switch with a button press, but, you know, you're just switching all the time, right? But that's the thing. What the game does well is making the level design so that most characters can handle situations, while others can get past certain challenges with no problem, and it being great to do on both of those options. Let me use a more generic example here in the game. One of the lessons that the game teaches you is to look before you leap in certain areas, especially areas with pits of death. If you don't know the environment and keep on moving forward without thinking, you may end up jumping into an enemy that will knock you back, and possibly throw you into a pit and kill you. This, of course, has been seen back to even the most brutal of games like Ninja Gaiden. So, every character has to learn this lesson, right? It doesn't matter which character I am, right? Well, no. In fact, there are some characters that naturally deal with this better, like the Jetpack Alien, but there's one in particular that I want to highlight here. Howie. Howie has a jump attack that lets him somersault. It's a strange angle of jumping at times, but there's one thing in particular that I need to highlight about him. That while somersaulting, he's immune to damage. Now, if he jumps recklessly forward, he's not going to knock into something like the others, and thus, he's not going to have the same problems. But I also know some of you, and in the back of your minds, you're probably saying, wait, Dragnix, if he doesn't learn the same lesson, then how do you learn the lesson with other characters when you first hit that crab? What happens when you just so happen to be the right character at the right time, then switch to a new character later on and come across the same enemy? You may have not learned that lesson. And you're right, but it's exactly one of the reasons this level design is so good. Because it naturally switches things up in a way where you're naturally drawn to switch to a new character at certain points, but gives you multiple opportunities to learn the lesson and to learn the environment layout to see key elements about it. It's not reusing elements here at all, but most of the time you can tell key elements that will give you information that gives you a hint that maybe this character could be the right choice for this situation. And it's not always something plainly obvious, like an enemy being of a bone type. Even the spacing between platforms and positioning of enemies can be a hint. What this does is reward the players who are the most observant and understand the most about each character and what exactly they do well, and are able to identify what's in the environment that can be to their advantage. And granted, not every character has to be switched to be able to take on every challenge. Some challenges you just need a little bit more precision, but if you recognize the information in front of you, it'll just make it a little bit easier. And that's the brilliance of it. It's doable, but if you're smart, it's even more doable. And both work because of the precision platforming that you have available to you here thanks to the controls. There are many situations that you can land on what seems to be a very narrow platform with a character to hit an enemy with that may seem crazy to try at first. But if you're confident enough, you'll be able to land it every time. Sure, you could take your time and maybe use Petal's homing to get rid of a tough placed enemy, for example, but you could also just land and use someone like Paula to get up close and personal if you feel that you are confident enough to do it. Because each character has different ranges of attacks and movement, you can use them in a lot of different ways to handle the same situation, and all can be viable. And what makes it all come together is the actual level design at play here. The traps, the actual placement of the platforms, all combining together. Look, this is going to sound hyperbolic, but this may be one of the best sets of levels in a platformer that I've played ever. Like, every level here has something to give. Yes, even the dreaded water levels that mess with physics. I know a lot of people don't like them, and a lot of the time I'm not exactly a fan of them either. But I ended up enjoying every single one of them here and every single level. Now, is it the best in any one category? Is it as difficult as some of the hardest challenges of Celeste? No. But if I were to look at multiple categories within level design, things like adaptive difficulty paths, where somebody who is more skilled can take a better path, and somebody who wants a little bit more of an easier time can take a easier path for them. Yeah, I would say so. The ability to speedrun if you know what you're doing. Yeah, thanks to some characters, I could see some characters doing well on certain stages, or even getting to the point where you're like speedrunning with one character. Fallen Leaf is coming up with high marks in a lot of these criteria that I could come up with, and it's coming up with it across the board. Not many games hit that when it comes to platforming. The only thing I will say is that if the developers wanted, I would take some of the endgame content in terms of the type of levels that you have there, which I won't spoil for you, and add a new set of levels like that as a DLC to this game with a ramped up difficulty. Because while the game isn't easy at all, I mean it is easy in certain places, but those people looking for an extreme challenge may want a little bit more, and I could see that working hellishly well with something like that. Granted, the base game needs to sell more, and that's the point of this review. Buy the game! Even though I'm not done with this review, buy the game now! Now that I've threatened you out of nowhere, let's also talk about some of the other elements of gameplay here. Now, you have choices in levels and certain branching paths, but each level that you do play has a treasure to find at the end of it, which could have use in a variety of things, which I'll get to in a second. Levels will also have a P-person to find in many of them. In terms of the secretness of these P-people, some of them are plainly obvious, but some of them are clever enough where you're like, oh, wait, that doesn't look right. Oh, nope, there's something behind there. It doesn't get to the point where you're like absolutely looking at every pixel to try to find a secret, and it is secret enough where you could miss it the first 2 or 3 times you go through a level. So it's in a good place for that sort of secret hunting. Those P-people will get you upgrades that aren't necessary to beat the game, but they're reasonable upgrades that make your life a lot easier, especially in certain levels. Sometimes you'll also find a map that leads to a new secret level. And there's a good amount of extra content here, and that's not even getting to the more quest-based elements. There will be places where you just talk to people and learn more about the world and story. More on that in a bit. But some of those items you find in the levels, you'll be able to give them to certain people and get a reward. Sometimes it's a new character. Sometimes it's a piece of heart, created by the happiness that was generated from you doing the quest, which is actually rather reasonable when you think about it, and honestly I wish more games gave that as the explanation of why your health suddenly increased when you gave Bob a chicken nugget. I want chicken nuggets. But I need to point out the emphasis on detail in this game, and this really applies to the game overall, but I want to give you a specific example. There are moments in this game that will really stand out to you, because it's obvious that the developers and creators had fun while giving you a lot of reasons to talk to every person multiple times, and as different characters. One prime example of this clay folk right here. See, the first time you talk to him in-game, he's counting numbers, and he's at a high number when you first talk to him, really high. But leave and come back and talk to him again, reasonably quickly, and he's counting from scratch. Wait, so he's reacting to me in-game to how long I've talked to him? Let me try that out. Let's leave for a little longer and come back. Yeah, it's higher. And if you leave the level and come back after a later time, the time seems to be appropriate to how long you've been gone. Now, is it probably just recording the last time that you talked to this character and then making a subtraction and then altering the text based off of that? Yes, of course. But that little detail means a lot. That being seen by the player makes you feel immersed in the world, like the world is actually reacting to you. And it's those little touches that push a game over the edge for me, from being great to being brilliant. And it's not just those random interactions either. It's reactions that make absolute sense in the big picture. Remember Lubby? Well, when you first meet him, he talks about his brother and his family. And if you were paying attention during the game, you know that there was a family of lobsters that you ran across early on. So go back to that area and talk to the dad as him, and you get a nice little touching conversation. It's rewarding you for paying attention. And I'm sorry, there are mega big budget games that don't do little things like this. And yet, look at Fallen Leaf, impressing me at every turn. Moving on to the presentation. Fallen Leaf is impressive on multiple levels. And this is where I have to be clear. One of the reasons that, unfortunately, Fallen Leaf won't get as many eyes on it that it should is the fact that it's a pixel platformer. When you hear pixel art, or at least a pixel art game, people tend to almost look away in disgust despite having nostalgic feelings for games from that era. Maybe it's an oversaturation of games in the genre, but it also means that it's hard to stand out compared to others when there is that much saturation. Regardless, not everybody has that mindset, but there's also this weird fake correlation where people think that pixel artwork means that the person is less talented at creating artwork or anything along that line. I don't know why. Sure, it can be a different skill set at times, but man, I really wonder about who looks at this and thinks lazy or less talented. But regardless, I was impressed by Fallen Leaf's presentation, top to bottom. First of all, I want to hit on the character designs. I mean, look, this game understands that some of the best designs in video games, particularly in 8 and 16-bit eras, are basic yet filled with small details that make sense, and yet doesn't look horribly out of place for the character. Leaf having a leaf for his hair is a bit on the nose, of course, but it also reminds me of a pompadour style, which still is an actual human hairstyle. So yeah, makes sense. The helmet on Thorn having horns like, well, thorns, also makes sense. Even Willow being this old man that seemingly is frail and yet all over the place does remind me of a willow tree, even if that connection's a little bit more out there. The detail of the actual character portraits to me is absolutely stunning, even with the limited color schemes here. I mean, maybe it's just me, but seeing the ninja and the seriousness of her character portrait, it gets off her personality. Same thing with the upbeat portrait of Petal, and yet, these are still fun to look at. They have little details and a little bit of shading here and there. It's just nice. I do have to mention that one of the in-game events that you can do is get the characters drawn by an artist at the Comic-Con type event. That drawing can be used instead of these as the main portraits. And well, just look at some of these. They have their own charm and personality to them, and yet I couldn't stop laughing when I first saw them. Like, they're obviously not as good, but for some reason I still enjoyed them and used them at certain times. It's the faces. All the faces are just chef's kiss. As for the in-game artwork, let it speak for itself with environments like this. The color bleeds off the screen, and yet gives you a lot of detail of things like within the waterfall, the columns, and the little touches like the leaves that are flying in the wind really sells the landscape here. It's also very reminiscent of the games of the NES era, in particular with uses of the particular shades of oranges and greens that were common of games of the era, but not so much that it can't get that extra element out of them. What should be noted about this presentation is that the animation quality is high, where attacks and enemy movement is easy to see beyond the environment, aka it doesn't blend in, and small effects like bullets and glows and everything along that line highlights the action appropriately. The fact is that I'm not squinting to see, wait, what was that enemy doing, or exactly what is that enemy on screen? It all complements the gameplay rather well, and I'm also not guessing on what exactly it is that I'm looking at. Everything's clear, precise, and exactly where it needs to be. Sound design is straightforward and effective. Good quality sounds that emphasize the actions, easy to interpret information from those sounds to correspond with what they're doing, and all around is just great to listen to. Hearing the buzz from a laser gun is satisfying, while the pellet that Leaf shoots out isn't too shabby either. Now, is it the weakest of the presentation elements? I wouldn't say so. I mean, I guess something has to be the weakest, but the fact is it's on the par of the pixel artwork here, and even though it may not be as good as some other things in the game, it does the job in complementing the gameplay and the story when it needs to. Just take a listen, and you'll hear what I'm talking about. As for the music, let me start here. Who the hell is this music director? Why haven't I heard of him before? Why I'm saying this is that people need to start remembering this name, Logan Mayers. I hope I pronounced that correctly. He's the music composer of this game, and he also did some of the programming and level design. Yeah, this game was made by 3 people, by the way, but besides being too impressed with the quality of the product that they made with a small team aside, the music is something that I will put into my arsenal of music to listen to at work. It's high energy when it needs to be, and it's iconic in a lot of ways. It reminds me of the Mega Man soundtracks, which that is a high bar. Granted, it is a little bit different, but it always matches the stage and the energy that it's going for. Whether it's a mysterious desert and a little bit of that sort of like, ooh, you don't know what's upcoming with some of the instruments that it chooses. But the fact of the matter is that there was no music track in this game that I did not like. Take a listen, and you'll hear what I'm talking about. Finally, let's talk about the story, because there's obviously going to be certain assumptions made when looking at a game like Fallen Leaf. I mean, it's a retro-type platformer, right? And while you do have more modern-day versions of that platformer that have more story in them, not a lot of people are going to expect a whole lot of writing or even a coherent story a lot of the time. And yet, Fallen Leaf not only does absolutely fantastic at its humor and writing, it's able to even make a story that's actually rather fun yet meaningful in the big picture. It may be the thing I loved most about Fallen Leaf, and that's after saying what I did about the presentation and the gameplay. I mentioned the basic elements of the story at the start, and the game does follow the hero's journey archetype to a certain extent. But it's also clever about how it uses that, because it realizes that all of its characters aren't perfect, and that they all have certain quirks and weaknesses about them, especially the idea of the faded hero and the wise man archetypes. Now, I don't want to spoil too much about the main arc of the game and its story, as I do find that these arcs are ones that you really build up well into throughout the course of the game, and I really want you to experience that for yourself. But I find that the writer used common meta elements you see in a lot of these hero stories and mixed them up in a way that felt familiar, yet had its own little twist on it. It does stand out especially with some of the interactions with Leaf, Petal, Thorn, and Willow. It makes you question character motivations and their intentions in good ways. It makes you think and wonder, am I seeing this situation right? What is this world, and what is everything around it? And who is Willow? Who is Leaf? Who is Petal? But I will admit something. A lot of this writing is going for humor. And let's be clear, humor is one of the most subjective elements when it comes to writing. Not everyone is going to find the humor of The Hangover funny, especially if you don't know the culture of drinking and male friendships. Not everyone is going to find the humor of Shaun of the Dead funny if you don't know zombie movie archetypes. Not everyone is going to find Whose Line Is It Anyway funny, because some people are soulless heathens that aren't meant to have fun in this world. The thing is, there's a good variety of humor here, and I love it all, especially the bad puns. Look, I will openly admit that I love dad puns, and I'm not shy about it, and the game has a good amount of them. Many of them will come from opening the treasures at the end of stages, and the little sayings that come from the description. I legit was looking forward to every item I opened and waited to see what goofy thing it'd get me with next. I mean, if you watch my live streams, you saw that I was just sort of like, waited a bated breath in terms of these little descriptions, and I know that seems a little bit weird, but they got me a lot. With that information in mind, I want to say that Fallen Leaf kept on getting me with not only the dumbest jokes, but some clever references and good punchlines as well. One of the best things that the game did was play on expectations by doing something completely unexpected, and yet justifying it with a good joke or story element. The first time a living being came out of a chest was a bit unexpected, even though you knew that was a possibility because that's how the game started. The game was able to just sort of lull you into a false sense of, oh, well, okay, I'm just gonna get another item here, and then bam! A person. What? But it's also how these jokes can sometimes end up being a significant part of the story that absolutely makes sense for the story that's being told here. There's some really brilliant ways of how the story obfuscates that serious information in the form of lighthearted jokes and banter that are recontextualized later on to make them mean something. You almost feel a little guilty for laughing the first time around, but then you realize that may have been somewhat the point. That you can laugh at it as long as you take it seriously when push comes to shove. Okay, I may be reading way too much into the writing here. After all, some of my most beloved games all have deep story elements to them. But I found this writing to be one of the best for a non-RPG visual novel or story-based experience that I've seen in a long while. And even with that said, I'd still put it up there with RPGs, visual novels, and story-based experiences in a lot of ways. Maybe it doesn't have the depth of some of those other ones, but sometimes simple is better. The KISS principle can apply here. There's relatability to characters here that I do also like, especially with some of the situations that the characters are put in and side characters. And I like that the game isn't afraid to say that a character has a fault or two, but not necessarily putting the blame on them. I do like when the game gets a little sentimental. It does humanize the experience in a lot of ways that I do appreciate. It made me self-reflect on certain parts, and it didn't do it without forcing a message in bright neon lights. It lets small, yet significant dialogues and actions do the talking here. But with it being an almost tribute to old 8 and 16-bit platforming, you know that the game was going to have references from gaming and media's past. And they are well done here. They're twisted a tiny bit to be legally distinct from, the things that they're referencing. Some of them are plainly obvious, like Mr. Conehead here from Not Silent Hill, or the Rake Cavalier. Some of them may be more out there references to styles, like River City Ransom, or even this buff shark enemy that I for some reason am reminded of Street Sharks. Regardless, those who are looking for some nostalgia here, you are going to get it. In the end, Fallen Leaf is exactly what it says it is. A tight action platformer that pays tribute to the genre as a whole, but takes the nostalgia of the old days and transforms the game into a wonderful experience from start to finish. Its humor hits all the right notes. Its platforming challenges were varied yet required precision. And the game doesn't seem to hit a low at any point with absolutely wonderful difficulty and story pacing. The game's got reasonable content for the price, does have some flexibility when it comes to new and old platforming players, wonderful controls, and just is the definition of a polished game up and down, getting all the little details right. There's not a lot I can say about the game that's negative. Sure, did I want a tiny bit more difficulty at the end? Maybe, but that feels like nitpicking. And quite frankly, for the price, I just don't see how you get better value out of the platforming genre. Sure, you've got other great platformers, but this is up there with most of them. And that's why it gets a 97 out of 100, making it a must-buy, unless you're hurting for cash. But that does not take into account my enhancer system, which takes the more subjective element of games and tries to match a game to you. If you fall into one of the following categories on screen, add or subtract that score to the main score. If the first digit of your score changes, refer to this chart to see if it lies in the buyability rating for you. Now, with all the praise that I've put on this game, you'll notice that there isn't really a situation where you shouldn't buy this game. And that is purposeful. Granted, some people will need to buy it now and some may want to wait a little bit later, but this game is worth playing right now. And if you know anything about me, you know that there are certain games that I have in high esteem on this channel. Games like Valhalla Cyberpunk Bartending Simulator. Games like Wondersong, not Wandersong, Wondersong. Games like Hollow Knight. Games like Never Awake. And usually I try to honor them with a piece of artwork on my back wall. This is my indie wall of fame. Now granted, like my Never Awake review, I don't exactly have a piece of artwork prepared to put on this wall right now. I did for Virgo, but my fiance did that. My fiance actually ended up doing the Never Awake rug that is on this wall. But I will have to have something made. But for the time being, I think I have a reasonable solution for it. Do you get it? It's a fallen leaf. Okay, it's a leaf from the craft store, but regardless, it will be replaced in due time. But the fact of the matter is, it deserves a spot on the wall right now. Anyway, that's it for this review, and sorry that it took a little bit more time than my wanted, 2 weeks between reviews. I wanted to get this right, and I understand that getting it right is probably not a 40, 45 minute, 50 minute review, for some people at least, but I had to give you everything I loved about this game. This is sort of cathartic when a game that I see that is so wonderful isn't getting the attention that it deserves, that I need to gush about it in response almost. I mean, I did write a Steam review pretty much day one on it, but the fact of the matter is, more people need to know about this game. Go buy it, go play it, and share it with friends. And hopefully some bigger YouTuber or some bigger Twitch channel will play it, and it'll, you know, catch on fire. I mean, that's what happened to Among Us. Thank you for making it this far into the video if you've gotten this far. It's a long review, I know. If you want to see more content like this, hit that subscribe button and go watch me over on Twitch, because I do stream 2 to 3 new indie games a week trying to find the next Fallen Leaf. I mean, that's the whole point of that channel. I am playing through Mega Man Legends over on that. Every Friday I'm going to try to do it. But as for the next review, I have no idea. I mean, I put most of my effort and thoughts into this review, and I didn't even plan for the next part. So that's going to be fun, trying to find what game to review next. I know there are certain reviews that I'm going to try to fast track when the review keys are available, or if I get a review key, things like Key Locker, games like Demon School, the Never Awake DLC. But until then, you could always join the Discord to see what I'm planning next. It's in the description below. Anyway, that's it for now, and as always, keep on gaming, and play Fallen Leaf for God's sake.